Welcome to the SRM Insider Podcast. I am Steve Ross. I'm happy to join you all today. With me, I've brought along some great members of our team, and we'll be talking a little bit about zero trust architecture. So before we get into the zero trust architecture, what you all want to hear, I'd like to introduce my team members. So joining me today will be SRM's Head of Restoration and Recovery, Tom Yoxall. Tom, thank you for joining us.
Hi, Steve. Good to be here.
And along with us will be Matt Mettenheimer, an Associate Director in our Cybersecurity practice. Matt, thank you for joining.
Thank you for having me. Excited to talk about zero trust today.
Topic du jour is zero trust architecture. This is a term that gets mentioned a lot, particularly from some of our larger corporate clients. I know from my perspective in the last 18 months, I've seen a lot more of these questions. So let's take an opportunity today to dive in and explain some of the basics. So let's kick off with what is zero trust. And for this one, Tom, I'll start off with you. What is zero trust? Give us some of the basics and the principles, please.
Sure. So zero trust is a modern security architecture. It's designed to assume that nobody, regardless of whether you're inside the network, working from home or a cafe, you shouldn't be trusted by default. So it really is a complete different way of thinking apart from the traditional way. Traditionally, you would protect the perimeter of a network, and whatever's inside your network or working within your office would be trusted by default. Zero trust is all about making sure that every user or device that's attempting to access your network is verified regardless of the location or if you've had access previously. So it's very much about making sure that you should have access every single time you go to access that corporate device or corporate resource.
Got it. That's very helpful, especially as we see some of the threats out there in the landscape today, utilizing identity as a method of creating challenges within organizations. Matt, anything to add on zero trust from your perspective as a cybersecurity consultant?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think the reason why we're seeing so many organizations turn to zero trust, like you said, Steve, is, a variety of reasons, right? Tom mentioned, historically, we always looked at protecting the perimeter, and that was a really strong way to keep threat actors out. But I think over the last, let's say 5 years in cybersecurity, everyone will say it's not a matter of if, but when you get breached. And having a strong zero trust environment can really help minimize that impact. So I think we've seen a lot of organizations start turning to it, understanding that, hey, I might have the best firewalls in the game. We might have a really strong exterior network, but should someone get in, we want to minimize the potential impact that they can do. So it's really about building a lot of resiliency. And that's why I think we're seeing more and more organizations turn to looking to implement zero trust than your traditional models.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I think you touched on a key piece there was just building that resiliency and continuing to, ensure that internal actors have the right access that they need for the right reasons. Tom, it sounds pretty appealing. It does sound like there might be some challenges from a technical perspective. At a high level, could you give us some of these principles and what those challenges may be for organizations?
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, there are a couple of core principles when you're looking at zero trust. So you need to make sure that you're verifying explicitly. So as I touched on, you need to confirm who I am whenever I try and access those corporate systems or data. Should I have access? What should I have access to? Where am I coming from? So you really do need to verify explicitly that I am who I say that I am, and I should have access into that device. You should also look to limit privileged access. So that principle of least access is really important here. Restrict my access to the absolute bare minimum that I need as a user. If I don't need access to the finance system, for example, I shouldn't even know it exists, let alone have access to be able to try and log into it. And the final real core principle from my perspective, and I think Matt touched on it briefly there, is around assuming that you're working on a breached network. Act as if your network's been breached. Limit the trust of those applications and systems and act like they're not secure until they've been proven otherwise. One of the core phrases you'll hear around zero trust is never trust, but always verify. And it really is taking that to the next level. The key elements around this is, as I think you've touched on it as well, Steve, is around multiple layers of defense. Zero trust really, in order to be effective, should cover multiple layers, including identity, so your people, your devices, your processes, all of your endpoints, making sure that not just the users, but also the hardware that you're using is compliant when you're trying to access corporate data, your applications, so whether that be on-premise, cloud, SaaS-based, all of your networks, again, regardless if it's cloud resources or on-premise resources, and all of your corporate data, regardless if it's structured or unstructured data. So it is very much a multifaceted approach to network security as opposed to some of the traditional models.
That's really interesting. Matt, something to add there?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, those are absolutely spot on. And when you're thinking of kind of operationalizing, getting your organization into zero trust, I think when I talk to CISOs or CIOs or CFOs in particular, what's one of their biggest barriers to entry are two things that I see from the operations standpoint is one, how much is it going to cost? We have all these great tools already in place, but I might need to buy additional tooling and look at our environment. And it's going to be a pretty heavy burden from a cost perspective, potentially. So I see that as one of the large, real reasons why we see organizations not necessarily undertake it. And then the second being, as Tom laid out, there's quite a few parts of your environment you're going to need to get really granular with and into detail. And that can have a lot of operational load on your teams. So if you have a security team and you want to necessarily implement zero trust on your own or go about it individually, that can be a pretty tall order while maintaining, monitoring of your environment, going through your day-to-day patches. So I see those as two other very large barriers to entry for organizations that are kind of looking to go down this route is we might have to spend a bit more capital, but also we might have to spend that human capital. And the last thing people want is a burnt out security team who then might miss an actual live event because they spent the last 4 weekends working overtime to make sure that we can go through that process of implementing zero trust. So that's one of the other things I've seen that organizations have called out of why they might have been hesitant to go down that route initially.
That's really interesting. And I think that actually segues nicely into our next point, focusing around what organizations and industries should be considering zero trust. So Matt, kind of in that same vein, let's talk to me a little bit about organizations or industries that you think would most benefit. And then maybe if you've got a take on who would see less return on investment from that zero trust, could you share a little bit about that with us?
Of course. Yeah, always happy to. The first group of people who I always think, should be looking at these are highly regulated industries. If you are a company that works in the finance sector, zero trust is something that's going to be extremely important to help get you compliant with a variety of regulations, both, in the US, in the UK, Europe as well. And of course, they're coming online in APAC as additionally. So if you are in a heavily regulated industry, this is something that I see a lot of organizations want to drive to because you already have compliance obligations. You are trying to stay ahead of threat actors. And then also, the disruption can be pretty large if you do go through an event.
That's right.
Financial industries, when they do get hit, everyone takes a fine look at your environment to make sure that you're following best practices a lot more heavily than, let's say, maybe your consumer goods industries. So I see a lot of them getting a lot of benefits from going through zero trust. Now moving away from, specific sector, I think who also get a lot of benefit out of this is organizations that have a high cyber maturity already. We have all of our baseline, policies, procedures. We have our right tooling in place. We're not necessarily looking to, cover the baseline. We've already done that. And we're looking to find ways to just make our organizations more mature. So if you've gone through, your pen test, your assessments, you've invested in the tooling, you invested in either having, an outsourced MSP team that can, monitor you 24/7, or you have it built in-house as well. Those are the organizations that might be coming up to the point to take a really strong look at their environment. And really want to see, hey, should this be something that we implement, especially as you get to the larger size, because it can be an undertaking. Of course, anyone who has who has a low threshold for disruption. So if you're thinking about, if you're an online retailer, right, and you know that, hey, every second our website's down, we're potentially losing X revenue, that's also could be a really strong driver to bring in, these more complicated and more secure systems that do take that uplift. Because, hey, if an event occurs, we want to minimize that impact to keep our downtime as minimal as possible. But really, I would say go through the BIA process to understand that. You mentioned who might not necessarily be the right target audience to implement Zero Trust. Obviously, it's a great principle. Every organization should strive for it, but some people might not be there yet. I've walked into a lot of businesses where a board member or a CEO has seen it pop up in the news or an article, and they say they want to go implement Zero Trust, which I'm always about. I think that's a great opportunity. However, they don't have an EDR tool deployed in their environment. So that's always something I always want to recommend is let's get our baseline security first before we start going down the route of implementing a framework such as Zero Trust. Make sure that you have EDR deployed, make sure that you have firewalls, make sure that you also have the processes in place that should we go down a large exercise of implementing Zero Trust, we can maintain it. It's great to go ahead and spend 6 months implementing this process, but if we don't have the staff or the expertise to maintain it year 1 or 2 down the line, we're going to necessarily be in the same position 2 years from now and have to go through another heavy lift to make sure that we are following the correct processes to get the most effective out of it. So if you're a less mature organization, which is okay, there's other things I would say I would recommend spending your investments on prior to getting here. But if you are mature, you're a large organization, and you do have those, technologies, tools, and processes in place, this is definitely the route I think would be beneficial.
Great. Lot to think about there. I especially like that you're touching on the same point that we heard from Tom, which is that this is really tooling that works as a piece of a defense in depth, and that there is some of that initial investment to ensure that some of those other pieces are in place before we go to expand to Zero Trust. So love to hear that. I know from my perspective that lines up very closely to sort of like the defense or intelligence community in terms of security clearances, right? We don't want to trust all users with all things. We need it to be a need to know and a right to know. Thanks for that, Matt. So Tom, let's go back over to you. Obviously, we've got some organizations that have probably been listening to this, and some folks are saying, okay, I fit in with that. I am an organization that we should be taking this process, and others that maybe are not. If going from the angle of an organization that's saying, I do align to this, and this is a challenge I'd like to undertake, can you walk us through some of these next steps in the process and maybe, define anything where we're not clearly seeing the process here?
I think the first thing you need to look at is the business requirements. What are you trying to achieve and why are you trying to achieve it? So the first thing when you're coming into a Zero Trust network architecture is really understanding what your attack surface is. What are you protecting? If you don't really have an understanding of the what before you get started, you're never going to be in a position where you can properly implement Zero Trust because you're not really sure what you're looking to protect. So anything where you've got sensitive data, where is that sensitive data on your network? What applications is that data sat in? Who has access to it? Again, not just sensitive data, but your critical applications. If those critical applications go down or to be compromised, what would really cause your business pain? You've got to understand that. The same with physical assets, corporate services, anything that your business needs on a day-to-day basis to fully operate. You really, really have to have a good understanding of who uses it, what are they using it for, what's held within that system, and what's the impact if it goes down. From there, it's all around the users and permissions. So I gave the example earlier of, I don't need access to the finance system, so I shouldn't know that it's there. Some people in the finance team will undoubtedly need access to that finance system. So who needs access to what? What have you got in place to protect that from an identity and an access management perspective? So obviously factor authentication, potentially conditional access for allowing logons from outside of the building. And then it's all about threat modeling. Where's your crown jewels? How do users access them? What would the potential impact be if somebody was to compromise your network as that user? What can they get to? Really understand what the potential reach and impact is if one of those user accounts was to be compromised. From there, it's all around technology. So using that information, you can start to architect your network, understand what technology best meets your requirements, and then look at how best to implement it. I think my kind of key takeaway from all of this, we talk zero trust, you will likely see hardware appliances or software or companies offering services that is zero trust. Don't forget that zero trust is an architecture. It's a design principle. It requires that multifaceted approach that we talked about earlier. It's not just purchasing an off-the-shelf product that sits in front of your firewall or behind your firewall and then everything's okay. You've really got to invest in this and make sure that all of your core security platforms are working together in order to get the full return on the investment out of your zero trust network.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point to kind of give us as a key takeaway there at the end. Matt, I'll kind of put you on the spot. Tom just gave us a pretty good key takeaway here regarding sort of the maintenance, the care and feeding, if you will, around zero trust. Key takeaway from you from what we've heard today.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think Tom was giving really great pieces of information. And I just want to harp on the point is understand that, are you at the level to actually implement zero trust and make sure that you can maintain it? It's a really great principle, and it is a thing that I think businesses should strive for, but also understand where you are on that journey. It's not just as simple as Tom mentioned, buying a tool out of the box, installing it into your environment and calling it a day. It requires your organization to be thoughtful and continue this process, not just, 30 days from implementation, but year after year. So it is something that I definitely recommend organizations go down, but do it with a lot of thought and care. And should you ever need to understand that, is my organization, ready for zero trust, or is this something that we might have to build towards? I always recommend, talk candidly with, your CISO, your cyber advisors, such as us here at SRM, potentially your insurer, to get an understanding that this might be something that you want to journey down now, or, hey, let's build the roadmap to get there in a year from now, not necessarily today. So always like to keep that in mind, but really appreciate the conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. That segues nicely into kind of our closing here. So, of course, for those of you out there listening, as you consider your zero trust architecture journey, please do not hesitate to reach out to the folks here at SRM. We're happy to have a conversation around what that looks like and what some of your challenges and maybe even some of your accelerators may be. With that, I'll say thank you for tuning in. We welcome feedback. We're, of course, delighted to discuss any of the other issues raised today if you give us a call. This has been the SRM Insider Podcast with Steve Ross, Tom Yoxall, and Matt Mettenheimer signing off. Thank you.
We are SRM. Search your first call to find out more.